A rare 1973 Hongqi CA771 sedan was recently discovered hidden away in an underground parking garage in Shenzhen. This iconic model holds immense historical value, but its condition was far from pristine. The car was missing many interior parts and accessories, making any restoration seem like a daunting task. The owner had initially intended to restore it himself and had kept it in relatively good condition over the years. However, when I took a closer look, even I started to doubt whether I could bring this vehicle back to life. The interior was almost completely stripped, with no clocks, gauges, or radio to speak of. Fortunately, the car still retained its four-door panels in both the front and rear seats, which were in surprisingly good condition. When I opened the hood, things looked even worse. The engine bay was almost entirely empty. There was no radiator, no carburetor, and the work done so far seemed abandoned halfway through. The Brakemaster cylinder was also missing, making the restoration feel like an insurmountable task. It was clear that this was going to be a major project. Despite my concerns, I couldn't help but feel a strong connection to this classic car. It was like finding a forgotten piece of history, and I knew I couldn't just leave it there. After much consideration, I decided to purchase it and take on the challenge. After a long, careful transport, the car finally arrived at my workshop. Upon arrival, I was relieved to see that the body of the Hongqi CA771 was in much better shape than I had expected. Despite missing a few key pieces, the bodywork still had very straight lines with minimal rust. The front bumper was missing, but I was able to reattach the original rear bumper. As I continued inspecting the exterior, I realized that while it was missing some components, it still had a certain charm and presence. The spirit of the car was still very much alive. I started by reattaching the bumpers and carefully cleaning the exterior. One of the most satisfying parts of the restoration was the front grille, which when restored really brought the car's personality back to life. I was determined not to repaint the entire car, as I wanted to preserve as much of the original finish as possible. The paint had held up surprisingly well in many areas, with only minor chipping. This is a process that car restorers often refer to as round board paint, where you keep as much of the original paint as possible. I was pleasantly surprised when I washed the car, revealing that most of the paint was still intact. The only issue was some minor fading and a few small spots of damage. To restore authenticity, I had custom molds made for the missing screws and other small details. This ensured that the car retained its original look, down to the smallest parts. With the exterior looking more like its original self, it was time to turn my attention to the interior. The wooden trim, a signature feature of old Hongqi cars, had been damaged or was missing entirely. However, I was able to source replacement woodwork from other classic cars. The wood used in these vehicles, often sourced from rare trees like Daxianling pine, is highly valued for its craftsmanship. I carefully sanded, polished, and restored each piece to fit perfectly back into place. It was a labor of love, but the results were worth it. As the interior slowly came together, the car began to feel like itself again. Next, it was time to focus on the engine. The engine bay had initially looked like a barren wasteland, with only the frame and a few leftover parts. But after sourcing rare components and repairing what could be salvaged, I managed to bring the engine back to life. The radiator, carburetor, and brake system were all rebuilt from scratch, using molds I had made from the original parts. Even the missing wooden interior components were recreated from original materials I had in my stock. Every detail was restored with great care to maintain the authenticity of the vehicle. Once the engine and systems were fully restored, I performed a final inspection and made sure everything was in working order. Oil, water, and all the necessary fluids. With everything ready, I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I was ecstatic to hear it running smoothly. The feeling of hearing that engine purr again, after all the hard work, was indescribable. The restoration had truly paid off. A rare 1973 Hongqi CA771 sedan was recently discovered tucked away in a forgotten underground parking garage in Shenzhen. This model is a true gem in automotive history, representing the peak of Chinese craftsmanship during its time. However, when it was found, the car was in a sorry state. It was missing many of its original parts, particularly in the interior, which made the thought of restoring it seem almost impossible. The previous owner had initially planned to restore the car himself and had kept it in relatively decent shape. But after examining the vehicle closely, I started to have doubts about whether I could even get it back on the road. The interior was stripped of almost all its gauges, clocks, and the radio. Fortunately, the car still had its 4 original door panels, as well as the front and rear seats, which were in surprisingly good condition. Opening the hood only added to the challenge. The engine bay was practically empty. There was no radiator, no carburetor, and many essential components had been removed or damaged beyond recognition. Even the brake master cylinder was gone, leaving the car with an incomplete and non-functional setup. It was clear that this wasn't going to be an easy fix, but I couldn't bring myself to leave this historical car to rot. The moment I saw it, I knew it had to be saved, so I made the decision to purchase it and give it a shot. After securing the car, it was carefully transported to my workshop, where I could begin the long process of restoration. When the Hongqi CA771 finally arrived, I was pleasantly surprised. Despite its rough condition, the bodywork was in much better shape than I had expected. The car's body was still mostly intact, with straight lines and only minimal rust. The front bumper was missing, but I was able to salvage and reattach the rear bumper, which was still in excellent condition. Even though it was missing several parts, the car still had a certain charm and presence. The spirit of the car was intact, and I knew I had to bring it back to life. The first step was to restore the bumpers and clean the body. One of the most satisfying parts of the restoration was bringing the front grille back to life. Once reinstalled, it truly helped restore the vehicle's character and made the car feel whole again. Rather than going for a full repaint, I decided to preserve as much of the original paint as possible. I didn't want to lose the character of the car, and the paint had actually held up fairly well, with only a few chips here and there. In car restoration, this approach is called round board painting, where the aim is to retain the original finish while fixing the damaged areas. After washing the car, I was thrilled to see that the paint was still largely intact, save for some minor fading and wear. To maintain the authenticity of the restoration, I custom-made molds for the missing screws and components. This attention to detail ensured the car retained as much of its original appearance as possible. With the exterior now looking more like its former self, I turned my attention to the interior. Many of the car's original wooden trim pieces had been either damaged or were completely missing, but I was able to source high-quality replacement wood from other classic cars. The wood used in old honky cars is highly prized for its quality and craftsmanship. The pieces are often made from rare trees like Daxianling pine, known for its durability and beauty. I carefully sanded, polished, and restored each piece to make sure it fit perfectly in the car. This process was incredibly time-consuming but rewarding, as the interior slowly started to take shape again. With each piece restored and reinstalled, the car began to feel more like its original self. The next major task was restoring the engine. When I first looked at the engine bay, it was almost completely empty, with only the frame and a few leftover components. After sourcing replacement parts and carefully restoring what I could, I managed to get the engine running again. The radiator, carburetor, and brake system were all rebuilt using custom molds I had made based on the original specifications. Even the missing wood pieces from the interior were recreated using authentic materials I had on hand. Every part of this restoration was done with great care to preserve the car's authenticity. Once the engine was fully restored, I made sure all systems were working properly, including checking the oil, coolant, and other fluids. With everything ready, I finally turned the key, and to my delight, the engine fired up smoothly. It was a moment of pure satisfaction, hearing that engine run once again after all the hard work. The car was now ready to hit the road again, just as it had when it first left the factory. Today we begin the full restoration of an incredible piece of automotive history, a 1973 Honky CA73. This car is not just a vehicle, but a symbol of an era, and it has a fascinating backstory. When we first received it, the car was far from being in original condition. Many of the parts, like the flagpole and the badges, were replacements that didn't belong to this particular model. Even the flags that had been attached seemed more appropriate for a different version of the Honky. Our mission is clear. We'll restore it to its original, factory-perfect condition, step by step. The first thing we did was carefully remove all the non-original parts. For example, the side mirror mount appeared to be from an original model, but it turns out it was a later addition. We're replacing that with an authentic, factory-issued mirror. As we continue the disassembly, it's clear that the wooden elements inside the car are in good shape, but the finish has seen better days. Our plan is to restore this wood to its original glory, so it looks as stunning as it did when the car first rolled out of the factory. Inside, we also found that the window curtains were not part of the original design. These too will be removed and replaced with new ones that match the factory style. The radio system was another modification. It was replaced by the previous owner with a newer, modern radio. We'll be swapping that out and installing the correct vintage radio to maintain the car's original look and feel. When it comes to the dashboard and interior details, we're taking the same approach. The entire dashboard, including the clocks, is being restored to its factory state. The dashboard should feature a beautiful round, marble-like finish, and we're working hard to bring that feature back. The horn ring, which was missing its center, will also be restored. A new bright frame will be added, and we'll ensure it fits perfectly with the original design. Even the exterior handles were swapped out for incorrect versions. The original handles, which are iconic to this model, were replaced by generic ones that don't belong. We've found the correct original handles and will install them as part of the restoration process. The foot pedals, too, will be replaced with the original models. We're making sure every part is as authentic as it can be, down to the smallest details. Now let's focus on the engine. This Honky CA73 is one of the earliest cars ever produced in China, and bringing the engine back to life is one of our top priorities. In earlier videos, we showed you the condition of the engine, but today we're going to try to get it running. The previous owner told me that the car hadn't been started in many years, and they were never able to get it going, so it's been sitting dormant for a long time. But I'm determined to change that. When I first checked the engine, it was hard to tell if it was completely dead or if the previous owner just didn't know how to get it started. The first step was to connect the battery and see if the engine would turn over. Since it hasn't started in decades, we began by cleaning off the dust and grime from the engine. One thing to keep in mind is that the carburetors on these vehicles are prone to clogging. We'll need to clean them thoroughly to make sure the engine runs smoothly. Once that's done, we'll test the starter motor to see if it's still functional. Fortunately, after connecting the battery, the starter motor seemed to be working perfectly, which is a good sign. The carburetors themselves don't look too dirty, so we might not need to clean them immediately, but we'll monitor them closely as we proceed. The next step is to check the spark plugs and other components to ensure that everything is functioning correctly. If the spark plugs need to be replaced, we'll do that right away. Our goal is to get the engine back to its original working condition, and everything we've seen so far suggests that it's possible. After all the checks, we'll keep moving forward, cleaning and restoring each part to its original specifications. We've managed to get a spark from the ignition system, but it's not as strong as we'd like it to be. To fix this, the next step is to clean up the spark plugs and recheck the ignition system. After that, we'll reconnect the high voltage wires and see if the spark intensity improves. A stronger spark will definitely increase the chances of the engine firing up. After doing the cleaning and retesting, we're hoping for a noticeable improvement in the spark. Once everything is cleaned up and checked, we're finally getting a solid spark. Now, to improve the chances of getting the engine started, we're going to try using some starting fluid and see if we can get it to fire. If this doesn't work, we'll go ahead and replace the starter motor with a new one. The good news is that the spark is much stronger now, which is a positive sign. A stronger spark means higher compression, and higher compression increases the likelihood of starting the engine. After testing with starting fluid, the engine still isn't firing. So we'll try a more hands-on approach by using oil and pulling the engine manually to provide extra pressure. This method should prove that the engine is capable of starting, even if it doesn't fire up right away. If this still doesn't work, we'll have to disassemble the engine to diagnose the internal issues. But we're optimistic that we can get it running soon. I'm happy to say that we've made some solid progress. Now let's continue working on restoring this amazing car that's over 60 years old. In the previous videos, we discovered that the engine needed some repairs, and today we're going to see if we can finally get this Hongqi to run. We're now reinstalling the starter motor and reconnecting the battery to test whether the engine will start. The starter motor has been sent out for maintenance and is now fully serviced. With the carbon components replaced, it's operating like new, so we should be able to start the engine this time around. After getting the starter motor back into the car, we'll double-check the electrical connections to ensure everything is in good working order. With the starter motor back in, we're now moving forward with checking the engine's compression. We've tested each cylinder, and we're pleased to report that each one is holding a pressure of 10. Everything is looking great, but we're not taking any chances and will continue to monitor everything closely. We'll also check other essential components to ensure the engine is running as it should. A number of you have pointed out that the alternator on this Hongqi doesn't seem to be the original. Well, that's something we're addressing. We've replaced all 8 alternator brushes with brand new ones, and these are the first of their kind I've ever worked with. We're ensuring that every part of this restoration is true to the original design, and once these new brushes are installed, we'll be swapping out the entire alternator for the original unit that came with the car. This will keep the vehicle as close to its factory specifications as possible. Instead of relying on starting fluid again, we've decided to hook up an external fuel tank to directly feed the engine. The original gas tank is no longer usable because it's clogged with old fuel residue, so we're bypassing it for now. After connecting the new fuel supply, we'll check if the fuel flows properly into the carburetor. At this stage, it's crucial to make sure the fuel lines are working as they should. The engine is using the original mechanical fuel pump, so we need to pull fuel through and ensure it's properly reaching the carburetor. Once we confirm the fuel system is functioning, we'll try starting the engine again and see how it runs. This approach might seem a bit unconventional, but it's one that's worked for many classic car restorations. After replacing the brushes and ensuring that the fuel system is primed and ready, we're feeling confident that this Hongqi will be back on the road soon. It's been a challenge, but every step forward brings us closer to the moment when this historic car comes to life. We've made excellent progress with the restoration of this Hongqi CRA73, and even some of the more challenging components are starting to come together. This car is truly a historical piece, and as we dig deeper into its restoration, we're uncovering more about its unique story. Our mission today is to bring this iconic vehicle back to its original state and restore every detail to how it was when it left the factory. We began the process by disassembling parts that clearly weren't part of the original build. For example, the flagpole and badges didn't belong on this particular model. The flagpole looked more like something from a later version, and the badges didn't match the ones this car was originally fitted with. To restore it to its authentic look, we're replacing these parts with the correct factory ones, ensuring that the car maintains its original character and integrity. Inside the car, the wooden trim was in remarkable condition, but needed some refinishing to restore its natural beauty. The finish had aged over time, so we're carefully restoring it to match the original appearance. The woodwork in these cars was a point of pride, and we're making sure it reflects the craftsmanship that went into its creation. We also found that the curtains inside the car weren't original, so we've decided to remove them and replace them with period-correct curtains that match the car's original design. One major modification we encountered was the radio system. Originally, this car didn't have a radio, but the previous owner had installed an aftermarket control panel in its place. We'll be removing that and replacing it with the original radio that was designed for this model, ensuring the interior matches the original factory specifications. As we turn our attention to the dashboard, it's one of the most crucial parts of the restoration. The dashboard originally featured a round, marble-like finish, which is a key design element of the car. We're restoring this to make sure it looks just like it did when it was first built. The horn ring was also missing its center, so we'll be replacing it with an authentic part, complete with the original bright chrome frame. Every piece inside this car, from the upholstery to the dials, is being carefully restored to its factory condition, down to the smallest details. On the exterior, we also noticed that several components had been swapped out over the years. The door handles and foot pedals were no longer the originals, so we've sourced the correct parts and will replace them to maintain the car's original look. It's important to us that every part of the car, inside and out, stays true to the factory design, as this vehicle is a symbol of a specific era in automotive history. Now let's talk about the heart of the car, the engine. This Hongqi CA73 is one of the first cars ever produced in China, and restoring its engine is one of the most significant parts of the process. As we showed in previous videos, the engine was in rough shape when we first acquired the car, and it wasn't running. Today, we're going to test the engine to see if we can get it started. When we first opened the hood, we could see that the engine hadn't been started in a long time. The previous owner had tried to get it running but was unsuccessful. However, we remain hopeful that with the right work, we can bring it back to life. We started by reconnecting the battery and cleaning off years of dust and grime that had built up. The engine had been dormant for decades, so cleaning everything thoroughly was crucial. One of the main issues with these Hongqi engines is the carburetor, which is prone to clogging. We gave the carburetor a thorough cleaning to ensure that it would work properly once the engine was ready to start. After that, we tested the starter motor. The starter motor was still in good shape, which was a huge relief. The carburetor wasn't too dirty, so we didn't need to disassemble it further at this point, but we're keeping a close eye on it for any future issues. Next, we turned our attention to the fuel system. The car uses a mechanical fuel pump, which can easily become clogged after years of sitting unused. We connected the fuel lines and made sure fuel was flowing properly through the system. The original fuel tank was no longer usable because of old fuel residue and contamination, so we bypassed the tank and hooked up an external fuel supply to test the system. Once we were confident that the fuel system was primed and functioning, we decided to test the engine again. At this point, everything was set up, and we were hopeful that all the hard work would pay off. We gave it one more try, and after a few attempts, the engine roared to life. The starter motor was working well, the carburetor was functioning properly, and the fuel system was in great shape. With the engine running, we'll continue with the rest of the restoration. The next steps involve reinstalling the exterior components, including the headlights and front grille, which are being sent off for chrome plating. We'll also complete the final touches on the interior, ensuring every piece is polished and restored to match the car's original specifications.